Forget the schoolbook picture of Henry VIII, the broad-shouldered Renaissance prince in a bejeweled doublet, smiling faintly under a feathered cap. That Henry is a ghost of propaganda. A flattering illusion carefully painted, while the truth rotted behind the canvas. The real Henry, especially in the final decade of his life, was something far more grotesque and far more dangerous. He was a man consumed not only by power, but by the decay of his own body, a monarch who became a walking contradiction, the divinely appointed king whose very flesh had turned against him. By the 1540s, the King of England had grown so large that chroniclers claimed his waist measured over 50 inches. His once athletic frame, trained in the tilt-yard and hunting fields, had swollen into a hulking mass of flesh, beneath the rich brocades and cloth of gold. His legs were bound in layers of linen to hide ulcerating wounds that oozed and stank so badly that courtiers could smell him before they saw him. The stench was said to cling to the air in his chambers with sickly, metallic odor of infection and rot that no amount of perfume could disguise. His gait, once confident and purposeful, had become a slow, labored shuffle, each step strained. The swollen, damaged flesh of his legs and attendants often had to support him under the arms. He spent long stretches confined to a specially reinforced chair, brooding in silence or erupting into sudden, terrifying bursts of rage. Observers noted that his temper, once volatile but tempered by charm, had grown erratic and cruel. Some whispered that his mind had been altered by a terrible accident, a jousting fall in 1536, when his horse crushed him and he lay unconscious for 2 hours. Whether it was brain trauma, untreated infection, or a slow collapse of his health, the result was the same: a man no longer restrained by reason, only by his ever-worsening pain. In this state, Henry became even more dangerous to those around him. Physical suffering did not soften him, it sharpened his paranoia. Courtiers learned to read the slightest shift in his expression, to guess whether a remark would earn a jesting smile or a death warrant. The air at court thickened with fear. Servants dared not speak of his ailments, though they carried the daily burden of tending to his wounds, arranging bloodied bandages, washing away pus, enduring the smell in silence. Yet outside the palace, the royal image had to be preserved. Painters were forbidden to depict him as he truly was. Instead, they crafted visions of a still commanding king, legs hidden behind broad, ornate skirts, torso armored in silks and jewels. It was a theater of power, every portrait a lie, every banquet a stage. Only those within the inner chambers knew how much of the king's power now came from fear rather than vitality. But Henry's decline was not only physical. His personality, always a volatile mix of charm and cruelty, began to tilt toward something darker, more erratic. His need for control deepened into obsession, his suspicion into full paranoia. And as his body swelled and festered, so too did the cruelty of his reign. This was not simply the story of a king aging into infirmity. It was the transformation of a ruler into something monstrous, a sovereign whose legend would be remembered not for his statecraft, but for the horrors he inflicted on those closest to him. What follows is not a romantic tale of royal intrigue, but a descent into disease, into tyranny, and into a body and mind that were turning upon themselves. If you think you know Henry VIII, set that image aside. The truth is far more disturbing. By the winter of 1545, Henry VIII's body had become a battlefield and he was losing. The once mighty frame that had dominated the tilt-yard now sagged under the weight of disease. His skin, once flushed with the heat of hunts and dances, was pallid and waxy, interrupted by blotches of angry red and the sheen of constant sweat. Beneath layers of fine damask and fur, his legs bore the worst of it, deep, separating ulcers that split open without warning, leaking blood and pus into his linen wrappings. Physicians of the Tudor court, men bound by both duty and fear, tried every treatment known to their age. They lanced and drained, packed wounds with poultices of honey and resin, and wrapped his legs in bandages soaked in wine or vinegar. Some even applied caustic substances to burn away diseased flesh, a practice so painful that the king's roars could be heard through the palace corridors. Yet the ulcers returned, stubborn and angry, refusing to heal. Infection had taken root deep inside, and in an era before antibiotics, there was no true remedy. Each day was a negotiation between pain and ceremony. Some mornings, the king could stand only with the help of attendants, gripping their arms as he shuffled from chamber to chamber. At formal audiences, he sat upon an elevated, canopied chair not just for grandeur, but because standing for long was impossible. Meals were brought to him on gold platters, yet he could barely enjoy them. The rich feasts of roasted meats and spiced pies often left him bloated and breathless. Those closest to him learned to mask their pity. The rules of courtly life dictated that no one flinch at the sight of his wounds being cleaned or his bandages changed. Pages and grooms who assisted in these intimate ministrations spoke little, their faces composed into expressions of studied neutrality. But once outside the royal apartments, whispers spread. The king's body was rotting while he yet lived. The smell was perhaps the most damning betrayal. Courtiers wrote of a rank and unwholesome odor that clung to his presence, an invisible herald of disease. In the crowded chambers of Surmise or Hampton Court, the air grew thick with it, mingling with the smoke of torches and the perfume of courtiers. Foreign ambassadors, trained to navigate the subtleties of royal protocol, still could not hide the faint recoil when forced to stand too close. Henry himself seemed both aware of and in denial about his condition. In private, he raged at his physicians for their failures, accusing them of incompetence or worse, treachery. In public, he cloaked his fragility behind elaborate pageantry. Banquets, processions, and diplomatic receptions were staged as though nothing had changed. The king swathed in layers of jewels, ermine, and cloth of gold. But beneath the spectacle, every movement was measured, every smile hiding the effort it took to simply exist in that moment. The body that had once been his greatest weapon of strong, athletic, and commanding had turned traitor. And like any betrayed ruler, Henry's response was not submission, but wrath. If his body could not be conquered by medicine, then the world around him would be ruled with an even harsher hand. Pain, paranoia, and power fused into a single driving force, the will to control what he could, even as his flesh betrayed him. This was the paradox of the late Tudor court. The more the king's health decayed, the more unyielding his grip on England became. Those who stood in his presence saw not just a monarch, but a man locked in a desperate war against his own body. And in that war, everyone, courtier, commoner, or queen, risked becoming collateral damage. By mid-January 1547, the signs were undeniable. Henry VIII, monarch for nearly 4 decades, scourge of Rome, maker and breaker of queens, was dying. In the dim light of his privy chamber at Surmise, the once commanding figure lay swollen and pale, his breathing ragged. The great bed, hung with crimson damask, had become both throne and prison. Courtiers and physicians moved like shadows around him, speaking in hushed tones, as though even their voices might weigh too heavily on the king's weakening heart. Sir Anthony Denny, chief gentleman of the Privy Chamber, bore the grim duty of telling the king what few dared to say aloud, that he must prepare for death. It was a message couched in reverence, but unflinching. Henry received it with a heavy stillness, neither railing against fate nor offering acceptance, only a silence that seemed to press the air from the room. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was summoned. Snow muffled the city outside, and by the time Cranmer reached the palace, the king could no longer speak. Taking the monarch's hand, the archbishop urged him to give some sign of his faith in Christ. After a long pause, Henry squeezed his fingers once, firmly, and let them fall. Beyond the bedchamber, Surmise seethed with unspoken politics. Edward Seymour, the king's brother-in-law, ensured his allies had access to the king in these final hours, while rivals found themselves gently, but decisively turned away. The balance of power for the coming Regency Council was being decided not in council halls, but in whispered exchanges beside the dying king's bed. In the stillness of those last hours, the air was heavy with the scent of beeswax candles and the faint tang of snow drifting in from the river. The courtiers present would remember the moment forever, the slow ebb of breath, the faint rattle in the throat, the final exhalation that marked the end of an era. At around 2 o'clock in the morning of January 28, 1547, Henry VIII was gone. Protocol dictated that the news be kept secret at first. For days, Surmise carried on as though the king still lived, meals delivered to his chamber, guards posted at his door. Only the innermost circle knew the truth. The delay allowed Seymour and his allies to secure their positions before the announcement rippled outward to the court, the city, and the realm. When the death was finally proclaimed, church bells tolled across London. In the streets, the reaction was mixed: mourning from those who still revered the monarch, muted relief from others who had suffered under his will. Across Europe, ambassadors sent word that the most formidable sovereign of the age had passed, and that the stage was now set for a boy king and a council of ambitious men. Henry's body, massive even in death, was prepared for its final journey to Windsor, to be laid beside Jane Seymour, the one wife he called his true queen. The reign was over. The legacy, and the struggles it would ignite, were only beginning. On a cold February morning in 1547, the gates of Surmise Palace opened to a sight few in England would ever forget. The coffin of Henry VIII, a massive lead-lined casket, draped in cloth of gold, was borne from the privy chamber where he had died, down corridors lined with torch-bearers and black-draped banners. The air was heavy with incense, the slow tolling of bells reverberating across the city. In the courtyard, a great hearse wagon awaited, a towering construction of black velvet and gilded ornament, pulled by 8 horses caparisoned in black. Their heads bowed under plumes of ostrich feathers. Above the coffin, an effigy of the king lay in state, dressed in robes of crimson and ermine, a crown upon its head, scepter in one hand, orb in the other, as if Henry still ruled, even in death. Behind the hearse came the highest lords of the realm, walking bareheaded despite the chill, each carrying a taper. Dukes, earls, bishops, and ambassadors moved in solemn procession, their breath misting in the cold air. The streets were lined with silent crowds, the faces of commoners half lit by torchlight, some weeping openly, others staring in grim, quiet awe. The journey to Windsor was long and deliberate. At every stopping place along the route, masses were sung for the repose of the king's soul. Monks and clergy stood outside abbey doors to bless the passing cortege. At night, the coffin rested in guarded chapels, the flicker of hundreds of candles reflecting on the black-draped walls. At Windsor, the final stage of the ritual began, inside St. George's Chapel. The heralds proclaimed Henry's titles one last time, each announcement followed by the crashing of staffs against the stone floor. The coffin was lowered into the vault beside Jane Seymour, the queen who had given him his only legitimate son. As the dust settled and the last prayers were spoken, the heralds broke their staffs of office and cast them into the grave with symbolic end to service. The chapel's great doors closed, sealing the vault in darkness. Outside, the kingdom was already shifting. Power had passed to a boy of 9, and to men who would wield it in his name. But for that moment, all England stood in the long shadow of its most formidable and most feared king. The winter of Henry's decline did not chill the palace alone, it froze the hearts of those who served within it. Surmise, once alive with music, laughter, and the shuffle of silk across polished floors, grew quieter. Conversations dropped to murmurs as soon as a chamberlain's shadow appeared in the doorway. It was not illness alone that inspired caution, it was the king's growing volatility. Henry VIII had always been a man of swift temper, but now, pain was his constant companion, sharpening every slight into an insult, every hesitation into treason. The smallest offense, misplaced word, a look held too long, a hesitation before obeying an order could provoke a thunderous outburst. Servants had seen goblets hurled across the room, chairs overturned, and even favored courtiers dismissed. In the middle of a feast, the court learned to speak in half sentences and glances. News was filtered, softened, and often withheld entirely. Foreign envoys found their reports slowed by cautious translators who knew that delivering unwelcome truths could be fatal. Those tasked with reading dispatches to the king practiced their phrasing for hours, trying to anticipate which words might ignite his fury. Fear took root in the grandest halls. At banquets, no one ate before the king lifted his fork. At hunts, rare now, riders hung back, and willing to outshine him. Even in the royal chapel, prayers were offered not only for his health, but for the survival of those in his orbit. The factional struggles that had long shaped Tudor politics became more dangerous. Ambitious men like the Duke of Norfolk, or cautious Survivors like Thomas Cranmer moved as if across a frozen lake. One misstep could send them plunging into disgrace or death. Informers thrived in this climate, slipping rumors into the royal ear under the guise of loyalty, and behind it all loomed in spoken reality: the king's body was failing, and with it, the balance of power in England. The succession was unsettled. The factions at court sharpened their blades figuratively and, perhaps, literally. Some courtiers whispered of positioning themselves for the inevitable end. Others clung to denial, fearing that to plan for a future without Henry was to invite his wrath. For those who served closest to him, the grooms of the stool, the physicians, the guards, life was a constant test of loyalty and nerve. One day, a gentle word might bring the king's rare smile. The next, that same word might bring a growled accusation. Men entered his chambers with care, bowing low, eyes lowered, ready for anything. The court was a place of silks and jewels, but beneath the glitter lay an unrelenting tension, as if the walls themselves were listening. And perhaps they were, for in Henry's England, the only safe word was the one left unspoken. By 1546. The question that hovered over every whispered conversation and surmise was not if Henry would die, but when. His massive frame, once the embodiment of royal vigor, now moved with a ponderous, labored gait, each step slowed by ulcers, joint pain, and exhaustion. Even the finest silks and furs could not conceal the swelling in his legs, nor mask the ashen pallor that clung to his skin. The king's physical decline cast a long shadow over England's political future. The line of succession was precarious, balanced on the fragile lives of three heirs, each the child of a different mother, each a potential spark for civil unrest. Prince Edward, the sickly yet sharp-eyed boy of 9, was the official heir. His education and humanist ideals and Protestant theology pleased reformists, but unsettled the Catholic faction, who feared what a Protestant king, or rather, a Protestant regency, might mean for their influence. Princess Mary, Henry's eldest, stood as a rallying figure for England's Catholics. Her legitimacy had been restored by Act of Parliament, but memories of her mother, Catherine of Aragon, and her defiance during the years of annulment made her a dangerous figure in the eyes of Protestant councillors. Princess Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, was intelligent and poised beyond her years, yet still bore the taint of her mother's execution. Though reinstated in the line of succession, she had powerful enemies who whispered that the girl was as cunning and as treacherous as her mother. The court factions began to draw clear lines. On one side stood the reformists, led by Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford, uncle to Prince Edward, quietly positioning himself to dominate the Regency Council. On the other side stood the Conservatives, with Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, maneuvering to protect the Catholic cause and secure influence through Princess Mary. Every feast, every hunting party, every chapel service became a stage for subtle displays of allegiance. Who sat near whom, whose hand was clasped in greeting, whose eyes met all were signals read with the precision of a code. Courtiers became actors in a play whose ending none dared predict. For the script was being written in real time by a dying king's temper and the ambitions of those around him. Beyond the palace walls, rumors multiplied. Some said the French were watching, ready to exploit instability. Others feared Scotland might make a bold move to advance the claim of the young Mary, Queen of Scots, herself a granddaughter of Henry's sister. Merchants worried about disruptions to trade. Priests wondered which creed the next reign would enforce. But within surmise, one truth dominated: Henry's word was still law, and he could still destroy a man's career, fortune, or life. In an afternoon, none could openly speak of succession without risking the king's suspicion. Thus, the dance continued, elegant, dangerous, and always under the gaze of a sovereign who would not admit he was fading. The throne of England waited, patient and cold, for the moment it would be claimed. The winter of 1546 to 1547 descended on London with a damp, bone-deep chill, and within the stone walls of Surmise Palace, it was felt most keenly in the king's private chambers. Henry VIII, once the golden prince of Christendom, now spent his days shrouded in furs, the great hearths blazing yet unable to chase the cold from his body. The royal physicians came and went in near silence, bearing their ointments, tonics, and powders, each promising relief, none delivering cure. His ulcerated leg was dressed daily. They are thick with the bitter reek of separating flesh and camphor. The swelling in his body made breathing an effort, and when the pain flared, he would bark orders with the ferocity of a man unwilling to surrender to frailty. It was during these months that Henry's appetite for governance grew erratic. Some days, he summoned ministers for long councils, issuing decrees with a sharpness that reminded all of the man he had once been. On others, he refused audiences entirely, retreating into bouts of dark introspection. Reports from the frontiers, matters of trade, even diplomatic letters from the emperor and the French king all could wait if Henry's mood was black. Outside his bedchamber, the court was a pressure vessel. Edward Seymour and the reformists intensified their quiet maneuvering, ensuring the young Prince Edward's path to the throne would be guarded by their hands. The conservatives, sensing time running short, whispered of ways to secure Mary's influence and to blunt the Protestant tide before it could take hold. Foreign ambassadors watched closely, dispatching coded reports back to their masters. They described a king who was half lion, half ghost, his mind still dangerous, his body failing. The French noted with satisfaction that England seemed poised for instability. The imperial court worried less about diplomacy than about the safety of Mary, their Catholic ally by blood. By January, Henry's world had shrunk to his privy chamber, his chapel, and the guarded corridors between them. On rare occasions, he appeared in public, carried in a litter draped with gold cloth, his once massive presence now heavy and immobile. The people still cheered, though their voices carried a different note, less so. More farewell. Those closest to him felt the weight of history pressing in. Every word the king spoke might be his last royal command. Every signature on a document might shape the fate of England for decades to come. And yet, Henry refused to name a definitive regent for his son, leaving the balance of power to be settled. In the dangerous interregnum that loomed outside, the Thames ran black beneath a low winter sky, the mists curling around the palace as if to shroud it in secrecy. Within, the king's heart labored on, each beat a defiance, each breath a step closer to the inevitable. The crown was not yet vacant, but the realm was already bracing for its next chapter.